Think about the last time someone questioned a decision you made. Not a big decision, just a normal, everyday choice. What did you do? You explained yourself. You laid out your reasons, walked them through your logic, gave them context they didn't ask for, and tried to make them see why your choice made sense. And you thought you were being a good communicator. You thought clarity would earn respect, but something else happened instead. They pushed back. They poked holes. They asked follow-up questions that felt less like curiosity and more like cross-examination. And by the end of the conversation, you were defending a decision that never needed defending in the first place. You walked away feeling smaller, not because you were wrong, but because you turned a statement into a negotiation. Machiavelli understood something about human dynamics that most people never figure out on their own. The moment you begin to over-explain yourself, you hand authority to whoever's listening. You make them the judge and yourself the defendant. And no defendant, no matter how articulate, ever commands the room. You didn't lose their respect because your reasoning was flawed. You lost it because you offered reasoning at all, when what the moment called for was silence. That line cuts deeper than it first appears, because the pattern Machiavelli identified isn't just about speed of action. It's about the elimination of unnecessary performance around action. The fool acts and then spends hours explaining why he acted. The wise man acts and lets the act speak. You've been living on the wrong side of that line, and it's not because you lack intelligence. It's because you were trained, systematically and from childhood, to believe that explanation equals respect, that the more thoroughly you communicate your reasoning, the more people will value your decisions. But Machiavellian philosophy exposes the opposite. In every social hierarchy, in every boardroom, every relationship, every negotiation, the person who explains the least holds the most authority. Not because silence is a trick, because silence communicates something that words never can. The assumption that your decision doesn't require external approval to stand. And that assumption, that quiet, settled refusal to submit your choices for review, is the foundation of what sovereign minds have understood for centuries. Over the course of this video, you're going to understand exactly why your habit of over-explaining has been draining your authority in every room you enter, and you're going to learn the precise framework for replacing it with something the people around you won't be able to ignore. The psychology of verbal sovereignty. This isn't about becoming cold or withholding. It's about recognizing that the words you thought were building bridges have been building cages, and learning to stop. If these ideas resonate with you, hit that subscribe button for more top-tier content. Also, drop a "no explanation needed" in the comments so I know you're ready. Let's dive in. There's a behavioral pattern that most people carry without ever identifying it, and once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it in yourself or anyone else. I call it the defendant reflex. It works like this. Someone questions you, your boss, your partner, a friend, a stranger, and before you even register what's happening, you launch into justification mode. You explain, you provide context, you offer your reasoning, your thought process, your good intentions, and you do it instinctively, as though your decisions aren't valid until someone else agrees they are. This isn't communication, it's a submission ritual disguised as conversation. The roots of this go deep. Most people who over-explain were trained into it long before they had any say in the matter. Think back. When you were a child and made a choice your parents didn't like, what happened? You were interrogated. Why did you do that? What were you thinking? And the only way to survive the interaction was to provide an answer convincing enough to satisfy the authority figure in front of you. You learned that your decisions were conditional, valid only if you could justify them to someone else's satisfaction. That dynamic got installed before you were old enough to question it, and it's been running in the background ever since. Every time your partner asks why you made a particular choice and you spend 10 minutes walking them through your logic, you're not communicating. You're performing the same survival ritual you learned at 7 years old. The setting changed. The reflex didn't. And here's what makes this so corrosive to your authority. Every act of over-justification sends a specific signal to the person listening. It tells them, on a level beneath language, that you consider their approval necessary for your decision to be legitimate. You are placing them above you in the hierarchy, not with your words, with your behavior. Emotional intelligence means understanding that people don't just process what you say, they process the structure of how you say it. When you explain a decision once, clearly, and stop, that signals confidence. When you explain it 3 times, each time adding more detail, softening your tone, watching their face for acceptance, that signals something very different. It signals that you're waiting to be told your choice was okay. And the moment someone senses that you need their validation, something shifts in how they treat you. They start questioning you more, not less. Not because they don't trust you, because your own behavior is telling them they shouldn't. This pattern doesn't just live in personal relationships. It follows you into every professional interaction, every negotiation, every moment where your authority could either be assumed or surrendered. Self-mastery starts with recognizing that this reflex exists, that it was installed, not chosen, and that you've been running it on autopilot while wondering why your words never seem to carry the weight you intend. There's a reason certain people walk into a room and command attention without saying much, while others talk constantly and still feel invisible. It's not charisma in the way most people understand it. It's not body language hacks or vocal tonality tricks. It's something more structural than that, and Machiavelli mapped it centuries ago. Authority is not communicated through the volume of your words. It's communicated through the ratio between what you do and how much you explain what you do. The lower that ratio, the less explanation per action, the higher the perceived authority. This is the equation that governs how every human being unconsciously assesses status in a social environment. Think about the people in your life who hold genuine influence, not positional power, real influence, the kind where their decisions are respected without debate. Watch how they communicate. They state, they don't argue. They decide, they don't deliberate out loud. When questioned, they might offer one line of reasoning or none at all. And that restraint, which most people mistake for arrogance or coldness, is doing something very specific to the people around them. It's telling the room, I've already considered this. My process happened before you entered the conversation. You're being informed of the outcome, not invited to shape it. Now compare that to your own pattern. When you make a decision and someone pushes back, what happens internally? There's a spike of anxiety, a need to be understood, a fear that if they don't see your logic, they'll think you're wrong or irrational or selfish. So you open your mouth, and out comes the justification. Not because the decision needs defending, but because you need the discomfort to stop. And that's the trap. You're not explaining for their benefit, you're explaining for yours. You're managing your own anxiety about being perceived as unreasonable. And every time you do it, you teach the people around you that your boundaries are negotiable, that your decisions are open for appeal, and that if they apply enough pressure, you'll fold your authority down into something softer and more digestible. Machiavelli observed that a leader who explains too much is a leader who governs by permission, and governing by permission is not governing at all. This applies far beyond politics. In your relationships, at your workplace, in your friendships, every time you over-justify, you're governing your own life by permission. You're asking the room to approve the choices you've already made. Strategic thinking demands the opposite. It demands that you separate the quality of your decision from the comfort of the person receiving it. Those are two completely different things, and confusing them is what's been leaking your authority for years. Now, if you're someone with high emotional intelligence, and if you're watching this, you almost certainly are. There's a specific trap waiting for you that the average person never falls into. I call it the empathy trap. And it's the reason good communicators so often end up with less authority than people who can barely articulate a thought. It works like this. You're perceptive. You read people well. When you make a decision that affects someone else, you can feel their discomfort. You can sense the shift in their expression, the subtle tension in the room. And because you're empathetic, because you don't want to cause unnecessary pain, you rush to smooth the friction. You explain, you soften, you offer context and reassurance so they won't feel hurt or confused or left out of the process. And in your mind, you're being kind. You're being considerate. You're doing what a good person does. But here's what you're actually doing. You're prioritizing their emotional comfort over your own authority. Every single time. This is the shadow side of empathy that nobody wants to discuss. Empathy, when it's unregulated, becomes a compulsion to manage other people's emotional states at the expense of your own position. You become so attuned to what the room is feeling that you unconsciously contort yourself to keep everyone comfortable, and the first thing you sacrifice is the firmness of your own voice. Boundaries aren't just about saying no. Boundaries are about what you do after you say no. If you say no and then spend the next 15 minutes explaining why, softening the edges, making sure the other person isn't upset, you haven't set a boundary. You've opened a negotiation. And the person on the other side, whether they're conscious of it or not, just learned that your no comes with a discussion period. Machiavellian philosophy doesn't suggest you become unfeeling. That's a shallow reading. What it suggests is that you stop treating other people's discomfort with your decisions as a problem you're responsible for solving. Their reaction to your boundary is their experience to manage, not yours to preemptively cushion. The sovereign mind can hold space for someone else's frustration without reversing course. It can acknowledge discomfort without absorbing it. And most importantly, it can let a moment of tension exist in the room without rushing to fill it with words. That silence, the silence after a firm decision when the room goes still and waits for you to blink first. That silence is where authority lives, and every time you break it with justification, you evict yourself from it. Understanding the pattern is one thing, replacing it is another. So let's build the actual framework, the structure that allows you to shift from over-justification to quiet, settled authority without becoming cold, dismissive, or disconnected from the people around you. The first principle is what I call the one-statement rule. When you make a decision and someone questions it, you give one clear, complete statement of your reasoning, and then you stop. Not two, not three, one. If the decision is, I'm not going to that event, your response isn't a 5-minute walkthrough of your schedule, your energy levels, your previous commitments, and your need for personal space. Your response is, I've thought about it, and I'm not going. That's it. One sentence delivered with the kind of finality that doesn't leave a gap for appeal. The discomfort you feel in stopping there, that tightness in your chest, that urge to keep talking. That's the defendant reflex activating. You'll feel it. Let it pass. Don't feed it. The second principle is elimination of softening language. Pay attention to the words you attach to your decisions. I'm sorry, but I can't. I just feel like maybe it's not a good time. I hope you understand. Every one of those phrases is a status concession. You're packaging your decision in apology and uncertainty so the other person won't hold you accountable for being direct. Strip those out. You don't need to be rude, but you need to stop wrapping firm decisions in soft language that undercuts them. There's a vast difference between cruelty and clarity, and most people who struggle with this have been confusing the two their entire lives. Clarity doesn't need cushioning. When you state a decision without hedging, without apologizing, without trailing off into justification, the room hears something different in your voice. Not aggression, certainty. And certainty, in a world where most people are constantly second-guessing themselves out loud, is magnetic. The third principle is one that requires the most self-mastery, and it's the one that separates people who understand this intellectually from people who actually live it. It's learning to hold tension without resolving it. When you state a decision with finality and the room goes quiet, or someone looks frustrated, or there's a pause that feels uncomfortable, your conditioned response is to fill that space, to explain, to backtrack, to offer a compromise nobody asked for. The sovereign response is to let the silence hold, to stay in that tension without flinching. Not because you enjoy it, but because you understand that the person who breaks the silence first is the person who just surrendered their position. Deep psychology shows that most social dominance isn't established through what's said. It's established through what's not said, and who can tolerate the discomfort of that absence the longest. When you learn to sit in the quiet, after your own words, calmly, without anxiety, without the compulsive need to smooth things over, you communicate something that no amount of explanation ever could. You communicate that you are settled in who you are, and you don't need the room to settle with you. There's one more layer to this, and it's the one that prevents everything you've just learned from becoming a performance of its own. Because here's the real danger. You take these principles, you apply them mechanically, and instead of becoming genuinely authoritative, you become a person playing the role of authority. You go quiet not because you're settled, but because you're controlling. You withhold explanation not from confidence, but from spite. You use silence as a tactic instead of letting it be a natural extension of who you are. And people feel the difference. They always feel the difference. This is where shadow work becomes essential. The shadow of the sovereign isn't weakness, it's tyranny. It's the part of you that, after years of being too accommodating, swings to the other extreme and begins to withhold as a form of punishment. It's the part that confuses being unreachable with being powerful. It's the part that takes the principle of stop explaining yourself and turns it into stop letting anyone in. Integrating the sovereign archetype means occupying the space between those two extremes. It means you can be firm without being rigid. You can be selective with your words without being withholding with your presence. You can hold a boundary without needing the other person to feel punished by it. Self-mastery isn't the elimination of empathy. It's the regulation of it. It's choosing when and where your emotional energy goes, rather than having it extracted from you by every person who applies social pressure. Machiavelli is often read as a manual for domination, but the deeper reading is about sovereignty of self, the capacity to act according to your own judgment without being destabilized by the judgments of others, the capacity to make decisions that serve your trajectory and hold them, not because you're incapable of hearing feedback, but because you've already incorporated the feedback that matters before you opened your mouth. Strategic thinking at its highest level isn't about controlling others. It's about becoming so internally stable that external pressure doesn't rearrange you. When you reach that point, when your silence comes from fullness rather than strategy, when your brevity comes from certainty rather than calculation, you stop performing authority, you simply carry it. And everyone in the room can feel the difference. You came into this video with a question you've probably been circling for a long time, even if you never framed it this way. Why does communicating more seem to get me less? Now, you have the answer. You weren't failing at communication. You were succeeding at submission and calling it clarity. Every over-explanation was a small act of handing your authority to whoever happened to be listening. Every justification was an invitation for someone else to approve a decision that was already yours. And every time you softened a boundary to make the room more comfortable, you taught the room that your comfort doesn't matter, That pattern ends when you decide it ends, not gradually, not eventually. The next time someone questions a decision you've already made and you feel that old reflex rising, that urge to explain, to justify, to make them understand, you'll notice it now. You'll feel the pull, and for the first time, you'll have a choice you didn't have before: to let the silence hold, to let your decision stand on its own weight, and to discover that respect was never waiting on the other side of a better explanation. It was waiting on the other side of your willingness to stop giving one. If something in this video landed for you, if you felt that shift from knowing this intellectually to recognizing it in your own life, go to the comments and type "no justification." Mark the moment, not for anyone else, but because you're drawing a line between who you were in conversations before this and who you'll be in every conversation after. And if you're ready to keep building on this, if you understand that verbal sovereignty is one piece of a much larger architecture of self-mastery and inner authority, then subscribe. Every video here is built to hand you the strategic clarity that polite society doesn't want you to have. The kind of understanding that changes how you carry yourself, how you're perceived, and how much of yourself you give away without realizing it. Don't stop here. The video on screen right now takes this further than I could in this one. It covers the one dynamic where most people lose authority completely, even people who think they've already mastered this. I'll see you there. See what others miss, know what others fear, become who others can't.